This week, the NPS tour is going to take a botanical meander. Last week, in my National Park Service wanderings, I made mention of the functionally extinct American chestnut. Yes, as in chestnuts roasting over an open fire, which, unless you are in some very specific places, winter roasted chestnuts are darn hard to find. In my case, they can be found in front of a certain Japanese market in Seattle, but the chestnuts they're roasting are of Chinese origin. That's right, this formerly common, warming, Swedish, and comforting winter street food and social party activity are almost entirely absent from the American landscape, which is, frankly, a tragedy. The darn things are delicious and nutritious, and the trees are gorgeous in summer as shade and turn beautiful reds, oranges, and yellows in the fall. Chestnut leaves are very recognizable. They look exactly like what you would draw as a tree hand if it were made out of leaves. And you can see chestnut trees now, but they are what are known as horse chestnuts, which, while they do produce a nut that fulfills the role of the conker or buckeye, names for the chestnut nut, they are poisonous to humans and farm animals alike. Fortunately, they seem to not particularly affect wild deer, which used to eat the American chestnut with gusto as part of its winter forage. Which brings me around to just how the National Park Service is related to my love for the quest for the revival of an American chestnut. The American chestnut basically suffered the same fate as the European wine grape in the 19th century. While an entire industry and family fortunes, names, and legacies were dependent upon the wine grape, no European wine grapes meant no champagne as they knew it and as we know it. Absolutely poof, gone. And so no expense or effort was spared in the quest to revive the wine grape. But chestnuts, as just a seasonal and somewhat regional treat, rather than a multi-millennial industry that at time has backed financial systems, does have plenty of reasonable analogs. Walnuts, pecans, hazelnuts, peanuts, almonds, even soybeans if you get clever. So the efforts to resurrect the chestnut have been slower, but they are ongoing. So why does the NPS matter here? Well, for one, because National Park Service land has largely not been developed, it contains samples of the flora, that is, plant material, dating back to before colonization, which means rootstocks of American chestnuts are still there, sending up shoots and holding on, and are part of the effort to bring back this American building block. As far as I'm concerned, next up for consideration of tree revival, sassafras, another once proud tree that has also gotten knocked back to shrub status. Alas, there aren't really any great American chestnuts you can go visit, but there are places where you can spy chestnuts doing their darndest to hang on until a successful disease-resistant, self-sustaining hybrid can be spread about. There are some even in Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C., along the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Park, and even at Harper's Ferry in the confluence of Maryland and the two Virginias, that is, regular and west. But this is more of a, hey, go recognize the chestnut, spread the word, and if you have a chance, enjoy a roasted chestnut. Bringing back the mammoth or the dodo bird or dinosaurs might be good for a movie or whatever, but restoring this vital tree population, that is good not just for the humans, but for the animals and the insects and the ecosystem altogether. So we need to get on it. And now I clearly need to figure out a popular chestnut cookie recipe. I'll get back to you on that. Episode 108. Wood. Essential for food, war, and adventure. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at how plentiful and unregulated wood in North America both helped and slightly hindered this period of war and adventure. Mostly helped, but look, untracked woods can be confusing to hike and explore through and make a mess of war plans. Even the always thinking of Rome dudes understand this, and the World War II guys, even more. So if you want to know some of the ways wood contributed to this period of early America and its food, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. In case you were worried, we are still in the period of peak barrel. The wooden container for storage, especially when an item needed to travel, is still on. Yes, there is some metal container manufacture, but that's mostly just fancy or experimental stuff. Glass is still thick and heavy and used for the most special, precious, dangerous, and medicinal of liquids. For the rest, everything lives in pottery and wood, and plenty of dry goods are rumbling around in those slack barrels as well. But the first thing you need to know is that in war and adventure, what really matters is wood is required for the cooking of food. First and foremost, access to fuel for feeding people on the march for war and adventure will start to become an issue in American history. I mean, how would you like it if you had a nice farm and plenty of firewood for your food, smoking meat, laundry, and occasional visiting blacksmithing needs, and suddenly a military company descends on your farm and depletes like 20 years worth of supplies in a few weeks? That was the reality for more than one landowner, as America went to war for 40 plus years, more or less, with what felt like everyone they could reach. And this reality of war, and looking for more fuel faster, especially as industry is also firing up, the desire for coal will start to emerge. By the end of the 18th century, coal was pretty well established as a fuel source in Britain and Europe already. And now, for reasons, it's coming to America. In the last two seasons, it was clear that in the 17th century, well, there was possibly too much wood. But now that America is developing larger established towns, factories, industry, and setting up forts, wood suddenly isn't simply everywhere for everyone in stunning, apparently inexhaustible amounts. The first real war of the United States of America, the Revolutionary War, is also really the first time Americans really start to face the idea that they could possibly run out of wood. And the most vivid exemplar of this problem was the winter camp at Valley Forge and the surrounding countryside. As an actual iron forge in the past, there was already a pretty steady use of the wood surrounding the forge to fire the iron furnace, foundry, and associated smithy. But since the forge was on many acres of its own land, a plan for rotating wood use had likely been in place. After all, there's plenty of articles and land management books of the 18th century and later that discuss the need for a furnace or a forge or ironworks to exist on 10 to 20 acres of hardwood forest in order to have enough land for the trees to grow to reasonable size for use as the charcoal supply after they've been cut the last time. While there are modern fast-growing pines that can be ready to cut in as few as 15 years for some uses, hardwood trees, that is, things like ash, hickory, oaks, chestnuts, maples, the deciduous ones, the kind that lose their leaves, and the particular species which have the density to make charcoal which create fires hot enough for metal furnaces and forges, well, there's not really any way to speed up the growth of these trees. Dense wood simply takes time to grow. Getting all those tree cells packed together, there's nothing you can do about it. It requires time. In general, to go from key or nut or acorn to tree big enough to feed back into the American iron industry, a 30 to 50 year rotation was required. So, some wood measurements before we get going. English and American forestry both worked on the idea of a cord of wood. And a cord of wood is a pile of wood 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, about a meter by 2.5 meters, give or take. The average acre of mature hardwood forest produces about 30 cords of wood when you cut it all down. And the big food note here is that a skilled woodsman or lumberjack using only hand tools, no chainsaws, could produce about 3 cords of wood a day. And as you might imagine, that required a mighty stack of pancakes and sausage gravy for breakfast, and plenty of beef and potatoes in impressive batches of hash to fuel all that work. A family at this time burned between 20 to 40 cords of wood in a year, most of them in the winter, though a fair amount was also burned on a daily basis for the purpose of preparing and preserving food, as well as doing laundry, making soap, and other mixtures used around the house. After all, there were no drugstores to pop into to pick up things like tooth powder, washing soda, boot black, or metal polish, after all. So, back to Valley Forge. In 1777, that second winter of the war, approximately 12,000 persons, this was the soldiers and the associated campaign community, they descended on this partly open ground outside of the city of Philadelphia, with the Schuylkill River as one border and the Pennsylvania forests surrounding the other sides. And from that moment, wood for housing and cooking were in demand. While no contemporary map of the encampment exists, and there are no drawings or ruins of the huts they built, there are descriptions, and the building styles of the day were pretty well known. So what one sees when visiting the national park are all best guesses based on written descriptions from the letters and diary entries of the officers and ongoing archaeology. There are also surviving requests and bills and accounts kept around the supplies, which have also helped the estimation of the temporary population. So somewhere between 1,300 and 1,600 huts were built. And while there were a limited number of building techniques and materials available, we're dealing with people here, so there was quite a bit of individual variation in size, roofing materials, chimney and hearth construction, and how far into the ground the huts were dug. These huts regularly housed a unit of 12 men, and on more than one occasion also included parts of some of the soldiers' families. So yeah, variation in size for sure. Digging the floor down 2 feet or so would reduce the amount of logs needed to form a whole hut and also provide extra insulation against winter winds, though flooding and muddy floors in this situation could become a problem. And it is important to note, unlike the paintings depicting the camp of Valley Forge blanketed in snow, it was really more often a miserable muddy mess with the temperature in the high 30s and mid 40s Fahrenheit, that is about 2 to 7 degrees C. Wood was in such short supply for cooking that it was not particularly used for heating, and as a result, frostbite, to the point of entire limbs going dead and becoming gangrenous, became a problem. Even though it was not below freezing per se, men were still losing fingers, toes, ear edges, and on occasion legs to amputation due to the untreated infections that would occur in injured or dead flesh. As a side note, Valley Forge was the first site of an American mass military inoculation, the precursor to vaccination. Smallpox kept causing havoc among both Continental Army and British Army troops. By making sure the Continental Army would not succumb to outbreaks of the disease, it was one more way the American troops had an advantage over the British. They couldn't die of it themselves, they couldn't spread it to other troops, and they couldn't spread it to the campaign community, and they also couldn't catch it from people who might have it and enter the camp. The British did not follow such protocol and regularly found their numbers dropping due to deaths from smallpox. By the end of the 6-month stay in Valley Forge, there was not a stick of wood to be found within a day's walk from the camp. So somewhere along the way, firewood had to be added to the supplies that were provided to the men. Still, one of the most common images, food-wise, that comes out of the Valley Forge mythological industrial complex is the solitary soldier sitting by a fire and cooking a potato or some other foodstuff over it. Nonsense. There were a few established ways food was cooked in camp, and sitting over a fire, open in all directions to the wind and air, that is some wasteful nonsense. And don't get me started about how wrong a way it was to cook a potato, holding it over a fire. Stop. Sure, okay, you might nod and agree that this was the wrong way to cook, especially in a wood shortage. So how were these guys and the women keeping them in at least cleanish linen, cooking their potatoes and salt pork and peas and corn and flour and such? The answer? Indoors and in dugout stoves. First of all, in the nastiest cold, the damp, and the wind, as stuffy and close and possibly lice-ridden as those little log huts were, remember, 12 soldiers and possibly extra family, at least they were under cover and out of the wind. So using the little hearths that were built into these huts of mud and twigs and rocks most likely were still a better bet than trying to cook out of doors. Most likely, there would be a cauldron or some sort of iron kettle propped up over or standing on its three little legs over a fire. The bed of coals could also be used to dry wet flour or items of clothing, toast old bread, and bake the tasteless but incredibly essential flour and water fire cake. Alas, salt was largely absent this far inland for the common soldier, so usually the fire cakes were flavored with just ashes. And the coals could also be used to roast any squash or potatoes that could be got. In the kettle would go the peas or pork or potatoes, and let's face it, not only were there no spare sticks, there was likely an entire lack of squirrels and probably even rats. In such straitened conditions, those little tidbits of meat would be welcome and not scoffed at all. Since the encampment was in place for 6 months, the weather improved, and as you might guess, the need to cook indoors lessened. While our cowboy movies and 19th century recreation paintings tend to favor the campfire with a circle of men around it, the same Prussian efficiency that came with the drill master Baron von Steuben, of dubious pedigree, also lent the knowledge of the dug-out stove to the Continental Army. When we think of archaeology, we usually think of dirt surrounding stuff that we want to look at. But occasionally, the dirt itself is the object of study. Based on notes and a few contemporary, quickly painted pictures during the war years, a Prussian-style dug-down cooking space, or what was generally known as earthen camp kitchens, were definitely used by the Continentals. And there's even a link to a paper in the show notes with illustrations. So the basics of how this earthen camp kitchen worked. It's a circular trench about 2 feet or 40 centimeters deep, dug around a center circle of a diameter of about 16 feet or 4 meters. And all of that dirt is piled up in the middle. About a dozen fire pits are dug into the side of that center circle, and then a shelf of turf would be left above the little fire pits dug into the side. And a chimney hole would be cut into that piece of turf. A small fire would be laid in each niche, which would be defended from wind and rain. And then all the pots and cauldrons of each hut could be suspended above the small fire. In this way, the stew for the large meal of the day could be cooked, and the cooks would be warm next to the fire, and vegetables could be roasted around the fire and in the coals under the stew pots or cauldron. Clearly, far more efficient than the campfire of legend. And so while every single wall, hut, and redoubt of Valley Forge built of logs was dismantled and reclaimed by local farmers for use as firewood and fence posts and building materials, these dug-out camp kitchens, their traces remained in the dirt. Such geometric disturbances of the earth with handy fire traces embedded remain, giving testimony to the locations of some activities at the camp by regular soldiers. And until those were found, nearly all the traces at Valley Forge that had been tracked down had belonged to officers and were, usually mainly the house used by Washington as his headquarters. But anyway, shortages of wood and logistical problems of supplying an army were only one aspect of how wood affected war and adventure. While 12,000 people in one place for 6 months created problems in a wood-fired society and unfamiliar solutions to cooking needed to be found, the Lewis and Clark expedition had other issues. As they headed out into the Great Plains, they found that wood could be extremely scarce because not a lot of trees grow on plains. They did largely follow rivers, which are generally populated with shrubs and trees, and they were able to largely cut as they went. But not always. At times, they would have to collect dried buffalo dung as fuel, which is a common practice among nomads who follow grass-eating ungulates. However, since this was a new and unfamiliar practice, the expedition was occasionally reduced to gathering large amounts of scrubby sagebrush to make up for absent wood, or even using dried fish as fire fuel. Though the dried fish was likely fatty salmon and was probably used as fire starter, not as the main fuel of a fire. The American iron industry was definitely given a jump start by all these wars. Look back at episodes 91 and 92 for more of the details. But making all of that iron put a premium on supplying enough charcoal for the furnaces, the mills, and the smithing of the refined metal into tools. And of course, the hardest iron was often needed for all the axes required to fuel those fires. But mechanization of food manufacture was also starting to get underway in America. The first big change had been the increasingly sophisticated wind and water mills for grinding flour and corn grits. But as metallurgy improved, the production of stills increased, which led to the spreading of liquor and liquor-preserved foods. And these all had a better shelf life, which allowed them to be shipped and stored and sold. It also meant there were more sophisticated potteries appearing in the new America. There was more stuff to put into pots, so more pots were needed, and the kilns of this age were, you guessed it, wood-fired. But while pottery of the rough stoneware sort was spreading out, the sophisticated cousin of metal manufacture, glassmaking, was also starting to grow in America. Many of the lakes of New America, particularly the Great Lakes, had sand that turned out to be quite pure and excellent for making into glass. Once war moved off the lakes, glass manufacturers were making eyes at the shores. Not a lot of glass was being made in America during these years of war and adventure, but some was, and most importantly, the supplies, wood and sand and salts and sodas, were all being scouted out and mapped for future exploitation. Right now, here we are at the end of the 18th century and at the beginning of the 19th. Glassmaking was more of a mad scientist project than an industry, but that is just about to change. And the last big place the food system was being affected by wood was in boat building. Because this audacious baby America had the most and best boat building wood, it started attracting all the hotshot young whippersnapper boat builders who were being told back in the old country that their designs were impossible, that they were too long, too thin, too thick. All of them required trees and boards and timber that were nearly impossible or actually impossible to get back in Europe. And, that was all kind of true there. But when they came to America, land of the free, this was the land of the tree, they saw monumental oaks for thick timbers that could withstand nearly any bombardment. I mean, just check out the USS Constitution, which was also known as Old Ironsides. And just the very second America was a country, she was sending little fast boats to go check out the China trade. The tea clippers began racing back with the year's new, fresh tea, and the fastest ones were built in America with spines and masts made from American timber, because they had the tall, old-growth trees that had all but disappeared from Europe. And so in America, they could build fast, lean ships that were basically impossible in the old world. Some of these fast ships were hauling luxuries from China, and some were out chasing the new riches of Arctic fur seals and Pacific sea otters, and others still were continuing to haul human cargo from West Africa to Barbados to Brazil to Saint Domingue to South Carolina to Virginia, New York, Rhode Island, and to Boston to feed the ever-hungry labor market of New America. And a faster slaver ship meant higher survival rates and higher profits. So ships that hauled people for sale were regularly some of the fastest ships out there. After 1808, when England started enforcing the partial global ban on importing slaves, it was really partial due to the forever fight with Spain that made for some interesting sea chases, but anyway. When they started supporting the global partial ban on importing slaves, captured slave ships would be used to pursue other slavers because they were sleek, fast, and maneuverable ships. See again the book, The Black Joke. But it was these ongoing imports of people in American-built ships that would continue to shape American agriculture with these large plantation-grown crops, sugar, rice, coffee, and the wheat and corn that would grow along with them. Along with building ships, wood was also used to build the forts that was pushing out the Western American frontier. With the end of all the British treaties with the Native Americans, the colonists, who thought of themselves as the real Americans, they wanted to push west into this new, empty land. The original inhabitants, the locals, they were seen as annoyances that needed to be swept away. And so the next job for the American army, just as soon as it had become that, was to clear the land for what the colonists saw as its highest and best use, to be owned and to be farmed, and preferably with a big cash crop and some supporting food alongside. Without wood to build the framework, cook the food, and establish the earliest industry and import the workforce, the America we know now would never have been built. But it is amazing. Our higher than everyone else's sugar consumption, the desire for big yards, places for plenty of beef to get out and roam for our later consumption, and setting up farming and food production so that it happens in large batches and then is split up and shipped out. The groundwork for all that is being laid in this early period of war and adventure, and it's the prodigious supplies of American wood that make it all possible. Next time, I'll turn to the meat ration of this nation that's on the move and doing all the fighting with everyone all the time. Coming up, we'll check in with wild meat, provided rations of the salty kind, and fun with pemmican, and how it became its own industry and even had its own war. How all these topics will shake out, how many episodes it will be, and how many weeks it will take me will depend. But by the time we get to the end of Meat on the Hoof, and occasionally on the claw, it will likely be a whole new year. And so then, at last, I will be moving on to the flavoring the Americas gave the world, pepper sauces. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know you're out there, but even better than that, your reviews. A few words to review this podcast on your favorite podcast widget really do make a difference and help make me more visible to the food and history curious alike. Want even more food and history in your future? In a very different sort of podcast, Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters, I do a deep dive into the 19th century with a co-host, Jamie Lewis of Plague of Strength. Our goal is to look at all this historical stuff in context and to also enjoy or criticize the modern media that covers this period in time. You can find us at Prize Fighters, Circus Freaks, and Gangsters. There's still food, but now it comes with fashion, fighting, and fraud. Well, more like crime. Lots and lots of crime. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me on Threads and Insta as at THOA Food, for alas, I'm pretty much all X'd out. And all this information and any links I promised you are available in the show description.